Well, it is official. Session 2 of 10 of the 2022 Grantwood Country Forum, our three-legged stool that builds community around learning all things Grantwood and the people in this beautiful land of Iowa. And as well as opportunities for creative writing, which we will find out more about next week. And excuse me, okay. And so can everybody see my screen okay, or is my gallery on it and getting in the way?
No, that's okay.
Okay, good. Okay, that's just me. Okay, good enough. So I definitely want to give a shout out to our wonderful group of organizers, and including the Cedar Rapids Public Library, which began with Kevin, the program director, and Meredith Crawford, and the wonderful Lyndon, who is guiding and helping make these sessions happen every week. Thank you so much. And also a nod to the Anamosa Library and Learning Center. The Cedar Rapids Library reached out to them, made them co-hosts, acknowledging the pivotal role that both Anamosa and Cedar Rapids play in the life and legacy of Grantwood and all things Grantwood country. And the Cedar Rapids Museum of Art, including director Sean Ulmer and Kate Canal, curator. And we heard from Kate last week. We'll hear from Sean next week. And we'll also hear from Don Sly Terpstra of the Iowa Poetry Association next week as well, to speak about writing ekphrastically in response to art. So that will be very exciting indeed. Okay.
Joe, you should talk about your TikTok series while we're waiting.
Sure. I'll keep my eye out when she pops in. I'll shut up. But yeah, I could fill some time. I have an experiment going on right now. I heard about TikTok and I thought it was just goofy stuff for, kids doing dance moves and trying to go viral. But I dug into it and I learned that if you use hashtags and if you search directly for art history, museums, just whatever you're interested in, you can find some great content. The directors of the museums, whether it's the Rijks, the Met, the Whitney, everybody is creating little storytelling videos about artifacts or backstories and artists. And it's a cool place to be. It's a little annoying if you don't direct search for what you're looking for, because the feed would just random stuff in it. There's weird stuff in it. But so anyway, I kind of took a liking to it and thought, yeah, I'm a journalist, so I've told stories and short form, long form, radio, podcast, video. I've done it all. So I thought, well, I'll try this TikTok thing. And so I took some of my favorite stories about Grant Wood that I don't think have been highly published. Some are just versions of my own stories I've had published. And using video to kind of show the painting being talked about, dig up a photo of the historic person involved in the story. And I just started releasing these little videos. I've done 2. The third one comes out later tonight. And Deb has been kind enough to root me on. And it's been a fun experiment just to get these stories out in a very new form.
They're great.
Oh, thank you.
Joe, I wonder if you'd be kind enough to share with all of us a link or where we can find you to see some of those, because I would love to learn more.
Well, can you hear me?
Mm-hmm.
Can you guys hear me now? Well, actually, that was going to be a surprise.
Yes.
We're gonna play Joe's TikTok video about January. And so that was like an add-on for
I didn't know that.
Well, my day job gets in the way, Debbie, darn it. So I didn't get you contacted, but I got Joe contacted.
Great.
So yeah.
ABSP.
You do. And what I want to circle back to first is I want to set before we launch into that, I want to set a tone for what else is coming up. And I'm just going to share my screen this way because my full screen seemed to not like things very much. So let me see if it'll work this time. All right. So I don't know if you all know, but are familiar with America's Poet Laureate, Joy Harjo. Started in 2019. And Joy Harjo edited this wonderful anthology called When the Light of the World Was Subdued, Our Songs Came Through. And I think it just had come out last year when we did this forum, but with this whole new audience, I want to, and the theme of tonight being so much about the history of the land and people of Iowa, I really wanted to let everybody know about this anthology. It's amazing. And it includes our Iowa's own Meskwaki novelist, poet Ray Youngbear in it, of course. And her writing just sets a wonderful tone and spirit for what we're doing tonight. So I would like to quickly read her poem, Grace. I think of wind and her wild ways, the year we had nothing to lose and lost it anyway in the cursed country of the fox. We still talk about that winter, how the cold froze imaginary buffalo on the stuffed horizon of snowbanks. The haunting voices of the starved and mutilated broke fences, crashed our thermostat dreams, and we couldn't stand it one more time. So once again, we lost a winter in stubborn memory, walked through cheap apartment walls, skated through fields of ghosts into a town that never wanted us in the epic search for grace. Like coyote, like rabbit, we could not contain our terror and clowned our way through a season of false midnights. We had to swallow that town with laughter so it would go down easy as honey. And one morning as the sun struggled to break ice and our dreams had found us with coffee and pancakes in a truck stop along Highway 80, we found Grace. I could say Grace was a woman with time on her hands or a white buffalo escaped from memory, but in that dingy light, it was a promise of balance. We once again understood the talk of animals, and spring was lean and hungry with the hope of children and corn. I would like to say with Grace, we picked ourselves up and walked into the spring thaw. We didn't. The next season was worse. You went home to Leech Lake to work with the tribe and I went south. And wind, I am still crazy. I know there is something larger than the memory of a dispossessed people. We have seen it. And so that is a poem in empathy for the ongoing struggles and traumas that our Native nations are struggling with. And so on a lighter note, the next slide, I'm going to skip forward here, is Joe's illustrious video he was talking about. So let's see if we can get that shown to you.
January lithograph have to do with,
All right.
what does Grant Wood's January lithograph have to do with Pope Pius XI? I'm Joe Coffey, and this is Grant Wood Stories. Released in 1938, January is the third of 19 lithographs by American Gothic painter Grant Wood. The lithographs were sold by Associated American Artists, an artist-friendly operation that sold affordable art through catalogs, department store connections, and a New York gallery. 250 prints of January were made for the public, each signed by Wood himself. The price, $5. Wood was having a hard time in 1938. He was getting divorced, teaching at the University of Iowa where they hated him. The IRS was after him. A full year had passed since he had last completed a major painting. Oh, and the critics who loved him for American Gothic had turned on him, saying he oversimplified his landscapes and never depicted the realities of farming during a depression. Here's Wood's response. January. The bleakness of a cold winter is the subject. It's getting dark. A relentless wind blows and snow drifts are deep. Even the direction of the rabbit tracks suggests doom. Psychologically, right to left movement creates tension. The rabbit has yet to return to safety despite the approaching night. Limestone lithography is tricky. Without colors to work with, wood used different densities of repeating patterns in order to get darkness, textured brightness, and gradient shades in between. He also used dental tools to scratch in subtle details. Corn shocks were an endangered sight by the late 30s, by the way. Corn shocks were tied up, dried up corn plants arranged for picking cobs by hand for seed. Mechanical harvesters and balers were making them obsolete, efficiently separating seed and baling the plant stalks for livestock feed and bedding. Today, Midwestern cornfields are bare in the winter, except for the stalk stubble. So January is an allegory of sorts, a visual eulogy of a final chapter of a simpler way of working the land. It's a reminder that man versus nature and nature versus nature themes are cyclical in nature, like the repeating geometric patterns that emerge from the composition's abstract structure. At a glance, the aesthetic grace of this frozen moment outweighs the underlying narratives. AAA even made a Christmas card out of January. But like Wood's life at the time, the conflict and tension are definitely there. January won top honors in a jury survey by Prince magazine. It was also shown at the Venice Biennale, where it is said Pope Pius XI saw it and liked it, so a print was sent to the Vatican. As for the other 249 prints, they're owned by museums. If you're lucky, you can find one at a gallery or an auction house. As of late, January prints by Grant Wood have been selling for $4,000 to $5,000. What does Grant Wood's January lithograph have to do with Pope Pius XI?
Oh, that was so fun. Oh, I'm so
What does Grant Wood's January
sorry,
lithograph
guys.
have to do with Pope
me
Pius
being
XI?
awkward.
I'm Joe Coffey.
There we go. Oh my gosh. So I saw it first on Debbie on your Facebook page. And so that was just, thanks, Joe. Is there anything else that you would like to tell us about that before?
Yeah, sure. I would encourage everyone to get on TikTok. I know there have been some scary reports about who owns it and security and whatnot, but none of that has come to fruition. It's a neat place to play around. And like I said earlier when we lost Elaine, if you use the search and put in whether it's woodworking or history or whatever, you can find people who are in your thing. And then there's great content, professionals or just enthusiasts, sometimes people who are in that subject. And it's so much fun, and we all lament the fact that our attention spans have gotten so short to the point now where it's like these little bitty videos, but you know what, it is what it is. So as a writer, I found it interesting. I've written to video, for years. I used to be in TV news, so I'm used to that. But the idea of having a vertical screen and what do I fill some of this with? Because as I write on a blank Word doc, I know facts about this and that, and Lester Longman and all these names and these Grant Wood stories. You can't leave it blank in a video. So you have to dig up a photo of Lester Longman, and you have to go to the Library of Congress and search corn stalks in 1939. So your video could be as accurate as possible. And so I found the journey to be rather rewarding. It's a fun activity. And so I've got a list of a bunch of subjects I'm going to hit. So as you can see behind me, this is the Cleveland Museum of Art, the painting of January, which he did 2 years later. In between, he did a charcoal and crayon sketch to kind of feel his way around, but it ended up being this painting. And so, I spent part of my afternoon talking to James Berryhill, the gallerist from New York, who brokered the deal to sell the painting to the Cleveland Museum of Art, and he wouldn't tell me how much it was sold for. So I'm calling the Cleveland Plain Dealer, arts reporter, Stephen Litt, and I'm doing the journalist thing. I'm getting all the info I can, figuring out what can make it in this short video, what doesn't make it, and then covering it using video. And I don't know, as a writer, I think it's fun. And so when you release a video on TikTok, Sometimes people have comments, or you watch the view count go up and you get to think about, oh, well, what's my next topic? Maybe I'll do the February lithograph or whatever. So anyway, I've just been having fun with it, and I appreciate the opportunity to share that video.
Yes, well, I'm just tickled to be able to do something kind of spontaneous, and that's the flexibility of this forum. And so thank you again, Joe, and I'm sure we'll just keep talking more and more about things. I'm gonna and you know, and speaking of January, we're gonna see what's underneath that snow, right, Steve Hanken?
I hope so.
Because and before we move on real quickly, I am going to share a bunch of writing resources and links for Meredith to send out in her next week's email reminder to everybody. And so it's kind of some of the things that we found last year, some tips and tricks, and for those of you who may be creative writing reticent or poetry shy, or you know, I want to do whatever I can, give you whatever I can to encourage you to just try something that may make your particular soul sing. You know, we're rolling around in this. This is a little bit of a workshop sort of vibe too. We're sharing, we're rolling around in things. We're inspiring each other. So I hope you'll consider that, and I hope you'll consider Joe's video inspirational as well too, because the technology now is so inexpensive and fairly easy to use if you find the right thing and kind of get used to some of how some of it works. It can be just lots and lots and lots of fun. So without further ado, I'm going to share my screen with your slides, Mr. Steve Hanken. And I'm excited to have Steve here because I've rarely met anybody who is so inspired to go down so many rabbit holes and remembers so many things off the top of his head and gets people excited about what he's learned as well, cares about the credibility of the sourcing as well, and the underlying dynamics. So I'm sure what he has to say will be really neat for you guys to hear. So let's go on to dipping our toes into the rich history of Iowa's land and people. So are you ready, Mr. Steve?
I suppose I am. You want me to just start?
Is there anything that else you would like people to know about your love of the topic of Iowa land and all that sort of thing?
Well, if you live here, it becomes a part of you, I guess, more than anything else. And consequently, where I grew up in Scotch Grove Township, Jones County, Iowa, we lived on a dairy farm that was not very big. And we had lots of hills and lots of rock, and we didn't have much money. And so you have to kind of make it up as you go along. So when I got into Iowa history in the 6th grade, I was already pretty much into it. And it's just kind of stuck with me. And over time, I ended up going backwards and ended up in archaeology. I had tried to make a living doing sheet metal for 30 some years and learned all kinds of operations and all kinds of technology and all kinds of stuff. And every 4 years was getting laid off. So I finally decided that before I retired on nothing, I was going to at least have some fun with what I was doing when I worked. And I volunteered at the state the state archaeologist's office and found out I loved it and did it for the next 12 years. I worked for 5 different companies in 5 different states. I ran, we had a Bones Prairie project that was in Jones County. That was the largest historic archaeology project the state ever ran, and I was in charge of the lab. So for 2 years, I worked on everything that came out of it, which was 4 tons of material. And I wrote up some of it, and over time, I did lots of other projects. And here I am, retired with a retirement from the state of Iowa that I never figured I was ever going to get, working for a living, doing what I was doing before. And that I had no idea that I was going to end up that way, but I'm still doing it in retirement. I write and carry on and get involved with things that I know something about. And Grant Wood is right down the road from me. The schoolhouse is here in Jones County, and I revealed some things that people didn't know that were involved with this from the very beginning, only because I get to digging up things and that's what comes up. So I found out that Grant Wood had 2 schoolhouses and not just one, and they're still standing. Although it's not the best of shape, it's still there. Things like that. So that's it. That's where I'm at. And so I know something about geology, I know something about archaeology. And so I got drafted.
Yes, you did. So you have a lot to say. Are you ready? So are we ready for this next slide?
Yep, let's go.
Okay.
The landscape to a lot of people means lots of different things. Usually, a lot of people see the landscape only when the leaves change, and that's about the extent of it. Some of Grant Wood's greatest works are landscape paintings like Young Corn, which was the previous slide, where he exaggerated the hills and the trees in the valleys with the lollipop trees. He took something that most everybody looks at, but looks past, and made us look at it. Now, this is my own analysis of what I see and what Grant Wood did. But the normal person that looks at this is like, what's with the trees? You know, whoever saw a tree that looked like that? Whoever saw a hill that looked that perfectly round? And I think he took that same thing and repeated it throughout the paintings that he did with his overhauls, with his windmills, with his chickens, all those things that are commonplace that we don't even pay attention to, especially on the farm. You don't pay attention to that. That's just part of what goes on. And we ignore it. And he made us think about it. And I attribute this to his friend Jay Sigmund, who told Grant to paint what he knew. And after that, it was up to Grant to figure out what that was. And I think that's what he's done. And that's what made him famous. It's taken something that we didn't really notice and made us notice. It's kind of like Starry Night with Van Gogh. To make those stars roll and flow into the landscape is something we don't pay attention to. But he pulled it out and made us look at it. And that's what Grant Wood is doing. That's what I think. I'm no art historian, I'm no art person, but that's what I see from a local yokel. Sigmund was an outdoorsman, a duck hunter, a poet, and part-time farmer. And he knew about the land. These pahas, which this picture shows, are present in Jones County. They're long, long hills. They all run from the northwest to the southeast, and they all come from glacial materials. The long upland hills were created by the after effects of the glaciers that receded to the north. The meltwaters of thousands of years of accumulated ice and snow, smooth rock and rubble that remained, and the ground up stone that washed out and caked along the waterways. Even the last vestiges of the Des Moines Lobe, miles away to the west of Jones County, the receding ice sheet met with the warm air to the south, creating a tremendous amount of wind, as any weather front will. With that wind was carried the fine ground stone and thousands of sand and silt bars along the outwash deposited for miles on the backsides of the glacial rock. So it was like raining little bits of silt and ground up rock along these beds of rock that were left by the glaciers until they filled in around those rocks. And once that happened, then the plants and the forbs started to grow as the weather warmed. And they acted just like windbreaks. And so when the sand and silt that was still blowing would hit these windbreaks of the trees and brush that were there, they deposited even more and more of this lusk was put there. It's similar to the lusk that you see on the western side, except those are coming right off the Missouri River, and they're really steep and really tall, and they also travel the same way. But clear over here in eastern Iowa, most of this lusk deposit is coming from this large deposit of ice that came down, they call it the Des Moines Lobe, that ended about where the Raccoon River and the Des Moines River join. And from that point on, when it started to melt, it receded back from there. And you have all these different changes as the meltwater or as the glaciers melt until you get clear to the far north. And then you have hummocks, which are piles of debris and ice. And when they melt it all away, you have these little humps. And there's all kinds of little humps all over the Des Moines Lobe. When you get clear up into the upper margins of the Des Moines Lobes, then you start getting lakes and ponds and what they call prairie potholes, which were the same thing. They were meltwater that came down through the glaciers and made deposits of water below the glaciers. So you got these little duck ponds all over the place. And then you've got the big lakes, the Iowa lakes to the further to the west, which are the last vestiges of the deposits of water that ended up making Spirit Lake and those lakes. So we have all of these different landforms that go all the way from the south to the north. But the in-between piece of ground that you can see on the map is this Iowa surface. And then you can see where the pahas are, these little dots that are brown and running from the west to the east. So when you go through Mount Vernon, Iowa, you go right across the top of a paha on the highway, and Highway 1 going to Iowa City. And there's another one that you get to just before you get to Martell, a great big tall hill. These hills formed from the northwest to the southeast, and they go for long, long stretches. And in between them, you'll have prairies, and you'll have sloughs, and you'll have everything else that comes in between them. And the water settles in around the outsides of these pahas, and in the Iowa surface, there's lots of hills, and around those hills, there's lots of moisture. When the prairies got started, these grasses that grew there were susceptible to lots of forest fires. Well, they were grass fires, and that's what kept the trees from the tops of the prairies. But before we get to the prairies, as the changes in weather happen, we have to go from these low ground yews and trees that were pine that could take colder weather, because this was still a pretty frigid area. As it melted and the tundra below it started to thaw out, more and more different plants started coming around. And that's where you start getting the prairie grasses. Well, when the prairie grasses start up, the trees recede into the wetter valleys between the hills, only because the forest fires are going to keep them off the top of the pahas. With the exception of the walnuts, which are black walnuts and white walnuts, and also the oaks. These trees are hardier, and they can take the forest fires and can recover from forest fires. But they still stayed in the wetter ground around the bottoms of the hills. The hills that existed were also great places. They were like sponges. They they collected all the water, all the rainwater and all of the snow melt inside of them. The Indians also use these pahas for places to camp. I'm kind of jumping around here because I decided I wasn't going to use my notes. I'm looking at the pictures and making that work for me.
Oh, sorry.
That's all right.
Did I jump too far ahead?
No, that's all right. We'll make it work. Go back to the Atlatl stuff.
Okay.
The Indians that settled here came in, they think, around 14,000 years ago, between 14 and 10,000 years ago, but we don't know for sure. There's not enough material left here to really tell what was here as far as Indians was concerned, and most of them were transitory. They were moving around a lot, and this is what they were hunting, was these great mammoths. In the later years, they had what they call the bison, which was about 3 times larger than the bison we know of today. And what they hunted with was this thing called an atlatl, which was a spear thrower. And there's all kinds of studies still being done with these spears and spear throwers. And most people thought that they were using these big spears, big spearheads for these big, massive animals. But apparently there has been some studies done that didn't work all that well, that the smaller arrowheads worked better for the bigger animals than the big arrowheads did, or big spear points did. And they've done studies and did this and tried it out, and that's what they found out. So that's all new. So we don't even know what they were using other than that they had these atlatls. The Indians, as time went forward, the people that were here before the settlers got here were primarily the Iowa and the Missouri, and they were original to the land. They're part of the Sioux tribe only because they speak the same language. The people that we associate with Iowa, like the Indians at Tama, are not from Iowa. They originated in Canada, in Michigan, and got pushed out and ended up in Illinois. The Fox are part of the Sac and Fox tribe, as are the Muskogee. They're all connected. They're all cousins. The reason the Fox have a different name from the Sac is because the French hunted them down. And they gave them the name Fox, or Renoir, which was the French name for fox, because they were so sneaky and they killed so many French trappers. So they were hunting the fox down. Well, they got to the point where the numbers were so small and their lands were getting even smaller because they were selling it off, that they decided that they would ask the Iowa if they could come across the river and live here. And the Iowa told them, yes, you can come. But remember, this is our land, not yours. And that was the way it was until the tribes got together and defeated the Iowa in southern Iowa, not very far from the little house that got incorporated into Grant Wood's painting, American Gothic. It's about 4 miles from there, where the Iowa tribe was attacked by the Sac and Fox, and they decimated the tribe, and the tribe moved off and went further south into Missouri, and eventually left Iowa and now settled in Kansas. Part of the tribe is in Colorado and part of the tribe is in Kansas. Why there's 2 different tribes, I have no idea, but they don't get along, which is another reason it's kind of funny. Blackhawk, who we see in this video picture here, was not a chief. He was considered a warrior. His father was a medicine man, and he had lots of respect because of his rank as a medicine man. So his son, Blackhawk, became a warrior and at an early age, killed several Indians in warfare. And he became a name for himself because he was a warrior. When they abandoned their land in Illinois, Blackhawk was not a happy camper, only because the way the tribes worked is that the tribes, individual tribes members had to basically approve of getting rid of any land or making any major decisions. There was no such thing as a chief that made those kinds of decisions. The chief was a spokesman for the tribe, but the tribe ultimately had the say. Well, he's the one that agreed to sell the lands in Illinois, and they went along with it. So they left Illinois and Sackanook, which was on the Rock River, across the river from Davenport. They were never supposed to return to Illinois. And when Blackhawk took a group of his followers across the river to go visit the graves at Sackanook, they discovered that their graves had been plowed under. And that started what everybody calls the Blackhawk War. That Blackhawk War was probably, normally if somebody would just come to visit their graves, they would have gotten there, turned around and come home. Nobody would have said anything. But the Illinois folks were all upset about them being there. And so the Illinois National Guard were more instrumental in starting the war than the Indians were. And they chased the Indians all over Illinois. And in the end, they got to the last battle, which this picture depicts, at the Battle of Bad Axe. The Bad Axe River was in Wisconsin, and the people that came with Blackhawk, the largest share of them were women and children and old people. We had about 1,000 women, children, and old people, and about 500 warriors. So when they got to, when the Indians got to the mouth of the Bad Axe River, they had already been decimated. They were trying to get the women and children and old people across the river. And that's what this picture depicts. The steamboat that you see that says warrior on it is the federal government's idea of how you defeat Indians, by floating out there with a big old riverboat with cannons, and you fire on innocent women and children and people trying to cross the river swimming or taking their canoes across. So by the time they got across the river, there wasn't many left. I think there were less than 800 people left of the 1,500 he started with, and many of them were wounded. And from that point on, they headed south to get back with the rest of their tribes. And the end result of that was the Blackhawk Purchase, which became the first part of Iowa that we know of today. And that included Jones County, along with the rest of the counties up as far north as Dubuque. And quite naturally, they had to include Dubuque because that's where the lead mines were. The lead mines were like having uranium mines in modern days. It was sort of like an important part of the military was to have a good source of lead for shot. And there was lots of lead there. And so that had to be included in the Blackhawk Purchase. So the Blackhawk Purchase happens and the settlers come streaming in. The first order of business is because all that lead is there, they have to, they created a road that went from Dubuque to the Missouri border, which is called the Military Road. And that was basically built for the lead mines in Dubuque. But the reality is that was a way to get people into the interior of Iowa. So when the lands office opened up, all these people would be able to move further to the inland parts of Iowa. And in short order after the Blackhawk Purchase, there were several other purchases that moved the border of Iowa all the way to the Red Rock, which was almost in the middle of Iowa. And then it was followed by several other purchases. About the time that I was beginning to be settled, which was in the 1830s, the state didn't become a state until 1846. And the reason for that was I did a little study on the first legislators, the territorial legislators of Iowa. And one of the legislators, when asked why it was taking so long to get Iowa into being a state, he said, well, the federal government is our cow and we will milk it as we see fit. So the end result was is they were working on trying to get as much money out of the federal government because they weren't paying any taxes. And that's how come it took so long to get to 1846 when it becomes a state. When Iowa becomes a state, about the same time, previous to the Mexican, or from the Mexican War previous to that, all the wars that were being fought were fought with volunteers. And so when you fought the wars, you were paid, but in the end, your bonus was when the war ended, you were given land according to what rank you held. So if you were a private, you got 40 acres of land. Of course, you had to go to where the land was available, and that would have been, later it would have been Iowa. Well, these warrants go all the way back to the War of 1812. So there were people that were 80 years old out east that still had these warrants. They never moved. So the government decided they wanted to clean up these warrants. This is an example of one of these warrants. And get rid of them. So they decided that maybe they should get it to the point where these guys could sell their warrants. Well, they had a couple of false starts, but in the end, that's exactly what happened. The guys out east that were 70, 80 years old, they had these warrants and people would come to them and say, how much would you take for that warrant? Well, I'll give you $10 for it. So he said, $10 is better than nothing. And they'd sell their warrants for 40 acres of land for $10, which if you bought it at the land office was $50. So that was a savings of $40 to whoever bought one of those for $10. Well, there were thousands of these around. So by the time the first people showed up in Iowa with these things, there was no problem. And lots of land was bought with these warrants on the cheap. There were people right here in Jones County that bought 1,000 acres of land, all of it with warrants. By the time the land office got to Fort Dodge, there were so many warrants, they had to have a lottery to get into the land office. So people were showing up with bushel baskets of warrants, and that was the only way they could deal with it. So that settlement was going to happen really quickly because all this land was pretty cheap and people moved in quite rapidly. And not to mention the fact that Napoleon was raising all kinds of cane in Europe, and wars were popping up from the French Revolution, trying to create countries much the same as the French had. So you were having revolutions in Germany, you were having revolutions in Denmark, you were having revolutions in Russia, and you were having revolutions in Austria. And the Austrian-Hungarian Empire was booming. And all these people, either they would be caught up in war or they'd end up fighting these wars, or they were in the wars where they were getting shelled and people were dying from starvation and that sort of thing. They were looking for a place to go. Now, many of the ships that were going to the United States were going there empty, and they were bringing back raw materials to Europe. So with the available land there was in the United States, it became a big business to haul settlers to the United States. They would put together knockdown bunks in the bottoms of these ships, and when they would get to Philadelphia or New York or New Orleans, they would offload their people and sell the lumber that was used to make these beds, and then fill it up with whatever raw materials there were and bring it back. So they were making money coming and going. Now, the people that first came into Iowa, a lot of them came up the Mississippi River. There were no dams on the Mississippi River, and boats that sailed from Europe would sail all the way into the mouth of the Mississippi and keep going all the way to New Orleans, or from New Orleans all the way to St. Louis. And once they got there, they would offload onto river boats and go up the canals into central Illinois, or up to Des Moines, or all the way up the Mississippi River to Dubuque, and then offload there. And all of these people would be flowing into Iowa. I did a kind of a study on the Civil War because I was kind of interested in some of the things that came out of the Civil War when they started talking about Iowa had sent more persons per capita to the Civil War than any other state in the Union. I thought, how can that possibly be? Well, I find out that the population was growing so rapidly. How you could take that and make any sense of it, I don't know. But when you have the census happening in 1860, and people were flowing in here from 1860 until the 1920s in piles and piles and piles, there were so many people coming in, how you could even say that, like, per capita, there was more people going to the Civil War is impossible. And they don't even have the numbers right, because the numbers of people that were in the military ranged from 75 to 77,000. So they don't even know how many people came from Iowa that were in the Civil War. So you can see how fast the population was growing, and it was settled from one end to the other by the 1920s. There was no land left. In Jones County, in the center of Jones County, was Wayne Township. Wayne Township was a boggy, wet place. There were no real strong flowing creeks there like there are now. Kitty Creek drains that whole township. It was the last township that still had land available in it because it was so wet, nobody wanted it. The Dutch and the Germans from northwestern Germany were the kinds of people that would settle in places like that. The Germans got here first, so they settled Wayne Township. The Germans and Dutch that came later spread out, and they went all the way to the beginning of the Des Moines Lobe, where all this meltwater was left from the glaciers. And it was just like home, except for there was no salt. They didn't have to deal with salt water from the oceans, and they didn't have to deal with storm floods when the high tides would come in, and storms would come in on the same time frame as the high tides and push the salt water inland. That's what happened at home. Here, they didn't have to deal with that. So everything was good. All they had to do was settle it. So here they came with their hogs and their sheep and their chickens and their ducks, and made a living on that wet ground and went to work on it with spades and shovels until they had drained the land. And now you have the richest country in Iowa, in that part of the country. So that's kind of what happened in Iowa as far as the settlement's concerned. The Indians, you know, the ones that are left are doing pretty good now, but there's still a lot of things to go wrong with the Indians. And I should not say that I forgot the Black people in this state. Iowa takes a lot of lumps for being a northern state that's pretty much backward when it comes to Black people. But the fact of the matter is that in Iowa, this man from Muscatine, Iowa, was responsible for making schools in Iowa open to both Blacks and whites 100 years before the Supreme Court ruled that the rest of the country should have unsegregated schools. His daughter wanted to go to high school, and he says, "You can't go, there's no Black high school." And he went to the Supreme Court of Iowa and got a ruling that basically said there should be no difference, that Blacks could attend high school the same as whites could attend, as long as they were. And he was creating public schools rather than having all private schools, because when the first schools started in Iowa, they were all private. And in short order, the people that were involved with desegregation of the schools and desegregation of the country, and were operating Underground Railroad lines, were also involved with this. And so they were working very hard on trying to make the schools open. We had a legislator from Jones County who basically said at the Constitutional Convention, he says, I went to school in New York and I sat with black and white kids. And he says, and it never hurt me. So I don't see why it should hurt anybody in Iowa. And so they basically opened up the schools as public schools. And this man, now I got to remember what his name is, Alexander Clark, is largely responsible for that. Unfortunately, they made him an ambassador to an African country, Liberia, I believe, and he went to Liberia and he didn't survive. But his daughter and himself, he first soldiers for the Iowa infantry. He was, for everybody that he recruited, he was supposed to dollars or something like that. And he never even took the money. He would, if he recruited some black soldier for the Civil War, he would give him the money. He says, you're going to need this money for uniforms and what have you. And so he gave people that he recruited that was supposed to be his. And he's, his house is still standing in Muscatine. They had to move it, but it's now on the National Register of Historic Places. And virtually no one knows about this guy unless you live in Muscatine. But he's really an important part of Iowa and Iowa history. So,
yeah, and Steve, I want to give a shout out to what you and Dorothy did last year in terms of discussing the Underground Railroad, specifically in the Grant Wood country area, and that tie into the Wood family being from Quaker tradition, because you guys did a really nice discussion, and Dorothy, Bryn, your son did a wonderful map to help give a little context as to, you know, that's kind of a whole other subject as well for this group. But tonight's about giving context to the land as a character and what we come to know about it on up to the time that and since that Grant Wood painted it. And so really value that. And then the people who came here kind of when, to get a sense of that. You know, that's another landscape that's inherited by Grant Wood as well as all of us. And so I'm really appreciative of this level of context. And I feel like kind of one of the next steps is at some point to maybe revisit the Quaker connection in terms of the development of Grant Wood and the culture of his family, you know.
that's true. And the Quakers as part of the land, there are other religious groups that are part of this Iowa settlement too, that have completely different ideas about human rights. And most of this is never taught. Nobody knows anything about this. I spent 30 years digging around in this Underground Railroad stuff, and it's just fascinating to me. But to sit down and write a comprehensive book about just Iowa and this one thing would take years, and nobody would read it. You know, with the exception of a handful of people that have a real strong interest in it, you can't get anybody to read a book anymore. That's the problem. Now, Mr. Coffey's idea is pretty good, because that'll make at least some sense to people. They'll take the time to watch something more than they will listen to somebody read it or read it themselves.
And I'm noticing in the chat, Stephanie, you're saying that your kids studied Alexander Clark.
I can say something about that.
Okay.
It's the 175th anniversary of Iowa. And consequently, they've been putting on lots of programming about Iowa and Iowa history. It's about time. And he's one of those people that are coming up because there are people pushing. And fortunately, that's the case, that the Black History Museums are taking up his cause, and some of the other people that have, at least in Muscatine, there's several people that I know that are pushing to make him kind of a hero in Iowa. Although unknown, they're going to try to make him more known. And just to show how crazy that is, there was coming up shortly is the history thing that they do with the kids, where they write papers, and it goes all the way to the Washington D.C. And if you win the national, it's a full ride scholarship, tuition, books, the whole works, someplace for a history. There was one kid that won that scholarship from Iowa about 10 years ago, and his paper was on this guy. He wrote about this guy. One of those judges in Washington says he did a really good job of writing the paper, but he says it's all baloney. It never happened. And that was a history person in Washington.
Huh.
But he still won. That's the good part. He won. So he ended up with a full ride scholarship to a school in Ohio, about $10,000 worth of schooling for free for one paper. That too is going to be on a Zoom session. They're going to start doing the judging and everything by Zoom because of COVID. It's coming up, I think, in March. I can't tell you what the name of it is. I judged one year, and that's about as far as I got with it. Anybody else got any questions? This is a really long and crazy thing to do because there's so much information here that I couldn't even touch on.
Well, Steve, I'm really grateful for you kind of giving us just all these broad strokes with lots of detail. And I just think it's great to help us jump off into, I think that, we'll be able to revisit some of these things as we're looking at the paintings that are coming up. And
there's so many goofy things about this glacier thing that people don't have any idea about. Silly little things like, did you know there were no worms left in Iowa after the glaciers? That the worms had to immigrate into Iowa because there was no worms here. And to this day, there are some places in Wisconsin where there are still no worms. Fortunately, the fishermen are doing a good job of helping that out. And they're moving further into the forest in Wisconsin where they have never been before. He's funny.
Could you tell us the name of the black man?
Alexander Clark.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Steve, okay, I thought that was really sad about the Iowa Indians, and they got double crossed by another tribe. What was the name of the tribe that kind of double crossed them?
Sock and Fox.
Okay. Are there still Iowa Indians left?
In Colorado and in Kansas.
Okay. Thank you.
You're welcome.
well, there's certainly some very interesting things about the Iowa, and it's kind of like, I mean, some things, are, we're rolling around in history, so it'll be fascinating to find out more as time goes on. how impactful this history is to people still as we try to write and revisit Grant Wood, who kind of, you know,
Well,
he's
the rivers, for instance,
yeah.
the Wapsipinicon River. The Wapsipinicon River is the name for what the Indians, the Iowa Indians, called a potato.
Oh,
The Maquoketa River, Maquoketa in Iowa means many bears.
ah. And Becky, were you trying to say something? Because you're muted. No? Oh, okay. All right.
So there are things that are left from the Iowa, but you know, they've lost their connection. I got this from the guy that's one of the people that's in charge of the Iowa tribe. He's one of the last speakers of the Iowa language because there's nobody left.
Yeah, there's lots of connections to be had, and there's you know, Grant Wood did do a series of sketches that would be considered highly stereotypes of negative stereotypes of Native Nations folks. And so yeah, so that's a thoughtful discussion maybe for another time to revisit that, but that connection is there as well. You know, we're all products of the biases of our moment. And so, you know,
Well, when you go down to Des Moines, for instance, and you go to the Iowa history thing where they have the farms and all that, and they have a section there on the Indians, which has just really gone to pot, apparently, from what I've heard. The first guy that did that was a guy I know whose name was Toby Morrow. Unfortunately, he has died, but he used to go there every day. He says, that was the best job I ever had. He says, I went there every day and all I had to do was find something that I needed and make it. And he says, and I built the wiki up and I built all the tools. And he says, and they had all that stuff there when I left. He says, but it's all kind of gone away. And he says, they didn't rebuild the wiki up like it was supposed to be. And he says that people that are talking about the Indians don't have any idea what they're talking about. And he says, it's kind of sad. He says, they could do it better, but no, they don't.
well,
And he says,
well,
Steve, Steve and Elaine, I want to go back to the Iowa soil because we're connecting a lot of this to some of our future sessions coming up, the importance of this. And maybe everybody on this session knows this, but you think that you're going to find black soil in other parts of our country. You do not. And I just want the people of Iowa to know how special that soil is, that black, wonderful, soft soil. I've lived in many states. You do not find that soil everywhere. You think you will. My mother can grow a ton of things in Iowa. I can never seem to grow anything outside of the state line. So it's such a rich heritage. And Steve, I'm so glad you spoke about this tonight. Especially I loved your Wayne Township piece because that's where my dad grew up. And I just want people to know how special it is. When you live in Iowa, you kind of take it for granted. I shouldn't speak for all of you, but you think you're going to find that soil everywhere? No.
don't find it here.
You just find it there, and maybe a little bit into Wisconsin and Illinois, maybe into the northern part of Missouri. But
Don't find it here anymore. You don't find it here anymore because it's been
That's
plowed
sad.
away.
That's sad.
that's
It's
such
pretty
a
special.
great, it's a great point, Dorothy. And I have memories of my grandmother, Hilda, constantly commenting in her soft-spoken way that she did that, you know, they're developing and they're covering up all that great Iowa soil again with urban sprawl, you know, and, you know, the developers, you know, so, you know, it's just, I think there's people who've been cognizant of it for a very long time, how special
Yeah.
the soil is.
I can't tell you how many counties I've been in and how many auger tests I've done doing archaeology all over the state and how infrequent that black soil is because it's gone. When they plowed and plowed and plowed and plowed, the dirt, the black part of the dirt, the what made it black was the humus, which is from plants, and that's light. And as soon as it rains on it, it washes out. And pretty soon the soil isn't black, it's gray. And when it rains on it, then it's black. You look along the streams, when you go down through the highways and you look off the bridges at any little stream, and you'll see the sides of the banks. Well, when it's dry, it's gray. But when it gets wet, the water comes up, it's black as black can be. But that's not because it's got that humus in it anymore. It's gone. It's been washed out of it. And that's what happens with it. You see all them sandbars and all that stuff. That's part of that we lost, because those prairie soils were created from the prairie plants that were growing on those soils. Those root systems went down 16 feet. And what they brought up was that sand. And that sand was mixed with those parts of the plants and the burned off stuff from prairie fires that made it black. And it takes a lot of time to make 1 inch of topsoil. And for the most part, we just wasted it. We plowed it to death, and we don't think anything of it. And we continue to do it. We have a hard time trying to get people to plant cover crops to save what little is left. And a lot of the soil now is nothing more than B soils. They are the subsoil to the A soil that were there. We're back to glacial soils now.
I heard a presentation today, actually, Iowa Public Radio, as I was driving, and they were talking with a gal from Iowa State University who was instrumental in starting those patches of prairie, native prairie that you see in the farmlands. I mean, you'll see like a big field of corn, and right in the middle will be this huge space that looks like could be farmed, but it isn't being farmed. And that's because they have started for soil retention, it's for water control and everything else. But there was a whole program started at Iowa State, and it hasn't been going that long. So, but you can see it in eastern Iowa if you drive down the highways, particularly now when there are no crops in the field. You can see these areas where it looks, I really didn't understand what it was. I thought it was just for water control. And so when I heard her on the radio this morning, I thought, oh, that's what that is. You know, they're planting prairie in the middle of the cornfields and the soybean fields and everything. So I think that's great. That's great.
We can actually see that from the air when we were flying into Iowa. You can see that from the air. And I was like I was like, what are they doing? But yeah, it makes sense
I
now.
suppose.
Hey, Steve, I want to make sure we get a question from the chat answered. To just repeat what you said about the worms from the glaciers.
When the permafrost of the glaciers came across Iowa, it killed all of the material that was in the, all the animals that were in the soil. So all of the worms were frozen out. There was just nothing left. So when it started to thaw, the only worms that were here had to immigrate. So those that were south of the glaciers had to come back into Iowa and replace the worms that were no longer there. And consequently, that's part of the reason why we have those dark soils, is that these worm castings create that black soil. And there was no worms left. There's a lot of things that we have here today that weren't here because of the glaciers. And there's lots of things that weren't here because they weren't here. We brought them here. If you want to take an example of that, take a look at dandelions. Dandelions were brought here because they were a form of early form of vitamin C, and you could eat dandelion greens and get your vitamin C when you couldn't grow oranges in Iowa, for instance. And there are other plants that have been migrating in too. As a matter of fact, a lot of the worms that got here more quickly were because people brought plants with them from their countries as they were coming here, and they planted them with worms with the plants, and pretty soon we have more night crawlers than worms.
Oh, we got more folks in the chat.
I had a comment about the soil around Stone City. Those hills are mostly clay, and that clay soil is part of the reason that the farms look like they do, because the farmer would be able to farm the top of the hill. If he farmed too far down the hill, the clay would erode, and it affected the way they farmed and what they grew. A lot of clay around Stone City.
Clay is all primarily glacial, because what the clay is it's really not the kind of clay that you would use to make pots with. What it is just ground up stone. And when you mix it with water, it's gooey and gummy, but it's really not the clay that you find deep in the ground. And the clay that's up there is, before there was clay there was black soil there. Maybe not a lot of it, but there was some.
Mm-hmm.
On the tops of these pahas, the other thing you'll find out is that if you went up there and you walked a paha that was plowed up, you wouldn't find any rocks up there. And if you do, it was brought there either by a manure spreader or by an Indian. Because blocks don't blow. And the only way those pahas were built is it had to blow to get there. So any rocks that are on top of those things either are indicative of the fact that there were Indians there, or it was brought there by a manure spreader. And that's the way you can find a lot of sites, is just walking the field on the top of the ridges, and that's where they'll be.
That's cool, Steve. Well, we're getting close to, if there's any last minute questions. Steve, did you want to, I don't know if you want to share your email with folks, but I know you're a good emailer and you will answer everybody's questions. So that's totally up to you. If you want to share your email,
You can share it
in the chat or something. If people want to get a hold of you. And while Steve's doing that, well, oh my gosh, that's session 2, and next week we're gonna switch it up again, and it's so exciting to think about having Sean Ulmer here and to talk about Grant Wood's evolution in painting style from his European influence to his more regionalist style. So exciting. And we'll also maybe get inspired to get those creative juices flowing as well. Think ekphrastically with Don Terpstra of the Iowa Poetry Association. Of course, there's many genres one could create in, and I think I was going to mention when our first reading session is February 28th. So at the end of next month, we have plenty of time for folks to learn things and roll around in some of the writing resources, and we can talk a little bit more about that sprinkled through our upcoming sessions, and give you guys plenty of time if you have something you'd like to write and share for that session. I'm really looking forward to hearing what everybody might have to offer after rolling around together in all this. So does anybody else have anything that they want to make sure everybody knows, or do we have any housekeeping to do? There's Steve's email if you want to pick his brain about worms and pahas and assorted and sundry other things. And I believe there's a science teacher in the house in case she ever wanted to weigh in on something. Don't be shy.
Well, I was just going to mention there is a phone number that you can text, and you can put in your zip code, and you will get a response that tells you who the first peoples were that lived in your zip code area. And I was frantically looking for it on my phone. Of course, I couldn't find it, so I don't remember it. Does anybody else know that? Steve, maybe you were the one who told me about it.
Didn't know
No?
anything about that.
That
No?
sounds fantastic.
Yeah, it's amazing. It's quite amazing, and I'm sorry I didn't keep that information at the ready, but
I've heard
Uh,
of that too, Sylvia, and I'll use my librarian resources and
Oh,
get that on
good,
the next piece of
good.
information we send you all.
I just couldn't find it.
Yay. Thanks,
No.
Lyndon.
Thanks.
That'll be awesome.
Well, Sylvia was asking about the ridges along the Cedar. When you're considering the outflow of water that came from these glaciers, those ridges are actually the side of where the river ran. So when the water came down, it was like 100 foot, 200 foot deep in a lot of these places. And so the ridges that are, the high ridges that are along the Cedar River is where the water ran. That's how deep the water was. The early people that were in those areas, a lot of times where you'll find the earliest people settling are on top of those ridges and where there are sinkholes, because that's where they got their water from. They couldn't get it from the river, it's too dangerous. But they got it from the sinkholes. They also got a lot of their food supplies from sinkholes because that's where they could get a hold of things like cattails and rushes and some of the frogs and that kind of thing that would be in those sinkholes. So most of the earliest sites of Indians in Iowa are in the Dubuque area where there were sinkholes. And there are some sinkholes along the Cedar that I have discovered, but I have yet to figure out whether there's any Paleo Indian sites there.
So Steve, how about like when you drive up toward Dubuque and there's all the rock and along the side of the road, what is that from?
When you get north of Dubuque, then you end up in a less glaciated area. There were glaciers that went there, but they didn't, the Wisconsin did not cover that area. So that made it a little rougher for sure.
Ah, interesting. So Stephanie Crandall, thank you. I don't know if you guys saw it in the chat, but Stephanie gave us the instructions that Sylvia was referencing.
Thanks, Stephanie. I just did it, and where I am, it's you're on Iowa and OCHETHI SAKOWIN and Sauk and Meswake land. So I don't know the
Over time, you're right.
yeah. Interesting. Thank you, Stephanie.
Well, our wonderful time together, I believe, has come to an end again. We've really packed this 90 minutes. You all are really good. And so I expect more next week. That's going to be exciting.
Thank you so much,
stretch out
everyone.
the time frame.
And
Yeah, thank you, Lyndon. We'll let you go have a life now. Get off the clock.
I took down all of the different links shared in the chat and also Steve's information. So if you weren't quick enough to get it all down from the chat, it'll be up on the recording. And also I took down those links that we can email out to you later. So thank you so much all for coming. And yes, I do need to go closing up the library.
Yep.